Hi, I'm Shelley Ochs. I'm a practitioner of traditional Chinese herbal medicine and acupuncture, and I'm also a translator. I translate medical texts from Chinese to English, and I happen to be working on a book at the moment about the origins of acupuncture in Shang Dynasty shamanistic culture. And today I want to introduce the classics. I want to introduce the idea of learning to read Chinese so that we have access to the 2,000-year medical literature. So a lot of people ask me, what's in the classics? And I find that sometimes people have one of two attitudes. One attitude is that everything in the classics works, and there's sort of a religious veneration of the classics. And the other attitude, which is probably more common in mainland China than other parts of the world, is to look at the classics as simply a storehouse of data that we can mine for modern information about herbal extracts, for example, or components of herbs that could be made into modern drugs using modern pharmacological methods of manufacturing, or that there may be little tidbits, there may be little gems regarding treating specific diseases. But there's a tendency to ignore what's really valuable about the classics. And I think what's really valuable about the classics is the overall philosophy, the overall framework, the overall set of ideas that we find in the medical literature in China. And I want to back up a little bit and say, well, what is that literature? This is a modern sort of classification of the 13,000 or so volumes that are considered part of the Orthodox medical canon at this point in time. And as you can see, there's a lot of different kinds of books out there. If you look at the seventh category formula books, that traditionally included things like the Shanghan Lun, which now has its own category, along with the Jingui up at number 3. And other books contain what we think of as case studies, as sort of philosophical or theoretical conclusions about how to look at a particular disease or a particular set of symptoms. And then, of course, there's lots and lots of other information about how one should live one's life. So cultivation or yangshen, number 9, is included under that. But it's really interspersed throughout all of the literature. How do we live in harmony with the seasons? What's the correspondence between a change in government and a change in the diseases that the people are getting? What's the relationship between reading the classics and meditation and the state of one's health? That kind of worldview is what you find in the classics throughout the ages. So a lot of people think that it's enough if we just read the Yellow Emperor's canon. Although I will say that there's not really a complete or a completely clinically relevant translation that has yet come out of the Yellow Emperor's canon. Paul Unschel came out with one this year that's the best out there so far. The Yellow Emperor's canon, I think it's important to understand what kind of book it is first. First of all, it was compiled over a 400-year period. And for that reason, because of the multiplicity of authors and the multiplicity of contributors, you, of course, find different schools of thought, even contradictory ideas within the book. So the book itself contains, it's an example of the plurality of the tradition of Chinese medicine, particularly, of course, of the time period from 200 BC to 200 AD. Those are the 400-year period that we're talking about. But the Yellow Emperor's canon is part of, well, we don't know actually, is part of a classification of books that you find in a book called the Han Shu, or the Book of Han. And that was compiled around 100 AD. And they list 8 books. And so if you look at this list, you can see that only the first one is still extant. And that is the Huangdi Neijing. The Huangdi Waijing, the second one, the external classic, may have been included in part in the Jiayi Jing, or what we think of as the Great Compendium, or the Great Compilation, which has been translated by Charles Chase. But all of the others have been lost. So you can see at some point in time, there was probably a master by school of thought or a lineage of medicine. There was Bian Chui, who's the subject of my research. He there's other evidence from other books as well to say that he was the first sort of school of acupuncture, and many of his methods contradict or they differ from the methods that you find in the Yellow Emperor's canon. And the last is the apocryphal classic, which, as its name says, is just that. So we know that from the very beginning there were competing schools of ideas and practice in China. And so that's one of the main reasons I think that it's valuable to be able to read Chinese yourself. First of all, only approximately 2 or 3% of the entire canon has been translated into any European language. And second of all, I think it gives you this direct experience, this direct knowledge of medicine in China. And we all talk about Chinese medicine as if it's one set of ideas. I speak that way too. I say things like that all the time to my patients. Chinese medicine says this, Chinese medicine is this. But it's important to not forget that that really is just a sort of heuristic device, that really is just a way of speaking that doesn't really reflect the historical or the clinical or the philosophical reality of medicine in China. So what is traditional Chinese medicine? There are a lot of people out there that seem to think they have a monopoly on what is traditional. But if you take the most cursory look at the literature, then it becomes very clear very quickly that that's not the case, that there are lots of different traditions, and how traditional do you want to be, right? There's a difference between authenticity and validity. So we may find that certain ideas are authentically part of Chinese medicine in the sense that they're old and they've been around for a long time and various people believed in them and used them. But validity is a question that we all have to decide for ourselves, and that's for each of us has to decide for ourselves. And that's part of why I think it's important to have access to that literature. Literature has a very different place in Chinese medicine compared to Western medicine. Obviously, knowledge in Chinese medicine has not been determined by the scientific method, right? That has not been the arbiter of truth within our tradition of Chinese medicine. And at the same time, even if we think of Chinese medicine as a scholarly medical tradition or as a tradition of ideas as well as practices, many, many, many scholars have noted that it's more syncretic than synthetic. And what that means is that material dialectics aside, as they've been promoted in mainland China, we find that competing ideas exist within our tradition for hundreds, even thousands of years, without anyone feeling compelled to decide whether A is really true or B is really true. And that, of course, is a strength and a weakness. But from our standpoint today, it really does make the literature a rich minefield of ideas, because contradictory ideas or ideas from completely diametrically different climates, different experiences of particular schools of thought or particular physicians, they're still preserved in the literature because no one felt there was this absolute imperative to decide whether one was true or not, and then only incorporate that and sort of preserve that within the tradition. So in short, I think that as practitioners today, many of us do have the opportunity to study directly with teachers, and I think that's very important. There are many, many aspects of medicine that can only be conveyed in the clinic from a master physician, first of all, but second of all, in complex clinical reality. Patients don't follow the textbooks, and they don't follow the classics any more than they follow the textbooks. In other words, you don't find exactly the same types of archetypal diseases or classic presentations of patients in the classics any more than you do in textbooks today. So if we have access to the literature, then in a sense we can have a deeper conversation with our tradition and become a part of it in a way that we just can't. It's a cliche to say that, reading in translation is like kissing through a veil, but I still like that analogy because I think it's true. If we have direct access, even if we feel that our classical Chinese or our mastery of the social, the philosophical context leaves something to be desired, and it probably always will. This is a lifetime project. Gaining that direct access still gives us a kind of knowledge that we simply can't gain through reading translations alone. So from my point of view, that's why I think it's important to learn how to read Chinese so that we can participate directly in that tradition. Thank you.